Hi everybody, welcome to another installment of WEGS Garage, this time with the old guy instead of my fuzzy-faced son. Due to the coronavirus pandemic across the United States, we're not working together, we're staying separate as we should be. But today, we're going to get into the transmission. And it's kind of a story of one thing leads to another to another. This all started with an oil leak out of our transmission casing. And the first thing we did was take the overdrive apart and check that out, found some things wrong in there and took care of the problem. The overdrive is actually still on the bench, laying in two separate halves. And this is almost ready to go. We're waiting for a spacer from one of our parts supplier to take care of the problem inside the overdrive unit. But again, due to the coronavirus thing, all of our parts houses are closed, so we're kind of at a standstill on that. But what we can do today is take a close look at that transmission, which Mark and I already did before the pandemic hit. And to give you a brief review of what's going on here, down on the floor with the transmission is actually split into two halves. There's a main shaft assembly here that extends out the rear end of the transmission. And up front, Triumph calls it the input shaft that actually goes in to the front of the transmission. Well, this I was able to get out without too much problem. And one of the things I've already found out is that on the end of the input shaft, inside this hole where my thumb is at, there is supposed to be a needle bearing assembly in there. Well, there isn't. And I have a feeling that once I get this other shaft out of the transmission, we're probably going to find the pieces to that down inside the casing. But what we're going to try and do today, what I'm going to try and do today, is take this main shaft out of the gearbox casing and get it up on the bench. And to do that, the first thing we have to do is pull the main bearing out the back of the gearbox off of the main shaft, and then we can slide this whole assembly up and out of the casing. And we have a special bearing puller that I'll be using to do that little feat with, and hopefully everything will go all right. So that's the story. Stick with me. We'll see how I do on this. Well, thanks to the old guy not knowing what he's doing with his camera, we missed the part where I got the rear bearing out of the gear case. Sorry about that. But basically the bearing puller pulled the bearing out, and then I was able to get the main shaft up and out through the transmission. But it's probably a good thing we did have that transmission leak, because what I'm about to show you is not pretty. Down on the transmission, gearbox, whatever you want to call it, this is the main shaft here that was in this position, and this is the bearing that I had to get out to enable to get that shaft out. Enough on that. Now as I look at the main shaft, there's a lot of different gears here, but one of the most important things is that on the rear of this, next to first gear, see if I can get this thing off here and not drop the camera. There we go. One thing that we know for sure is that between this synchro ring and this gear, there's supposed to be a spacer in here, a washer. It's not there. There's also some other gremlins in this gearbox too. Take a look inside of the casing. Right down at the bottom, there's an assortment of springs and balls that held those springs in, and needles. Not a good sign. Also, when I muscled the main shaft out, all that stuff fell out as well. So the bottom line, and by the way, this is the counter shaft over here for all of our mechanic friends out there. That looks to be in good shape. But the bottom line is, it looks like we're going to have to get this rack of gears up on the bench, go through it, and see exactly what's in spec, what isn't, what we need, and go from there. And that's what we're going to do next. Now that the input shaft and the main shaft are out of the gearbox casing, I can show you what we've got on the bench. If we look down on the bench, you can see the input shaft and the main shaft. The input shaft readily comes off of the main shaft, not a problem. The main shaft itself, if I pull a few things off, this, and that synchro ring, there's actually a clip that looks like this that fits over this shaft, over the teeth of the main shaft, and holds that spacer in there. And this thing is a real bugger to get out of there. It's hardened steel. The only way I was able to get that thing off was to take a pair of regular snap ring pliers and file the tips off of it, and also flatten the edges in this area, get it down into the groove, spread that clip apart, and very slowly start pulling out. It took me quite a while to get that thing out, but now this whole main shaft is ready for disassembly. We can go through the bushings and the gears and everything else and make sure everything is good to go. But I'll warn you, that's a real fight, because that is really some tough steel. For what it's worth, I did manage to figure out what some of those springs and balls went into that we saw on the bottom of the gearbox casing. I kept all of it, and they're in this jar. And what most of those are is that they are springs and balls that actually go inside of the synchro hubs, which, as you can see, there aren't any in there at this point in time, so it's a good thing I held on to everything that fell out of this thing. Some of the needles in there are obviously from some needle bearings they'll be needing replaced, obviously, but we'll take that as it goes. The actual counter shaft is a whole nother measure we'll save for another episode, because the counter shaft I left laying in the gear casing itself, and we'll get into that at another time. Well, that'll about do it for now from WEGS Garage with the old guy. We've got some work ahead of us to go through these gears and bearings and so forth, make sure everything's up to spec. Thanks for bearing with me, as this is my first video. Normally Mark would play some pretty music on our way out the door, ending an episode. And since this is my first video, I think you know what to play, Mark. How about a little Buck?
They're gonna put me in the movies. They're gonna make a big star out of me. We'll make a film about a man that's sad and lonely, and all I gotta do is act naturally.